Welcome to Sarat Samvad, an initiative for border studies in South Asia. Our guest for today is Dr. Mona Chettri. Now, Dr. Mona is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Australia-India Institute at University of Western Australia. She has also been a postdoctoral fellow in Department of Anthropology at Aarhus University in Denmark, where she was a part of a research project on the rise of special economic zones in Asian borderlands, which in particularly focused on the transformation of Eastern Himalayan frontier or borderland into economic corridors and special economic zones and its subsequent socio-political impact. Apart from this, Dr. Mona is also an editorial board member of European Bulletin of Himalayan Research and was also formerly associated with International Institute for Asian Studies. Now, Dr. Mona has published extensively on the Eastern Himalayas, particularly with regards to the Sikkim state in India, Eastern Nepal, and ethnic politics and borderlands of Eastern Himalayas. Now, Dr. Mona, thank you for giving us this time. And our first question to you is with regards to your extremely well-received book, Ethnicity and Democracy in the Eastern Himalayan Borderland. Now, this would be a two-part question. You begin your book on why there is a need to study the Eastern Himalayan borderland. Can you please elaborate on this further? And secondly, you have described Eastern Himalayas as political borderlands whose borders are now imperative for the construction and enactment of ethnic politics. So similarly, can you please elaborate further on this aspect?
Thank you, Ankur, for the introduction and for the question. And I'd like to begin by thanking Border Studies in South Asia and everybody who's associated with this initiative, which I think is very important and very timely, given that we have so much work that's being done on borderlands in South Asia. And it's great that there is a common platform where we can create a sort of a new network and also connect with people and also to share our work. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the organizers and Ankur also for the question and also for engaging with my work. It's quite rare that someone actually engages, very deeply with my work. So I'm really thrilled to be here and to be able to talk more about my work. So in response to your question about the need to study the Eastern Himalayan borderlands, when I say need to study, I'd like to clarify. I'm not saying that there hasn't been research on this region before. There's definitely been a whole lot of research, especially on the socio-cultural, religious aspects of the region itself, the historical aspects of the region, as well as of specific indigenous groups. So in that sense, there's definitely been a lot of research from researchers within the region, from within India and from abroad, right? And even in that, there is a lot of scope to do a lot more work. But when I say that there is a need to study this region, is that I feel that the Eastern Himalayan borderlands can be seen and needs to be seen also as a barometer of the changes that are happening regionally. And this is extremely pertinent because having been always considered or seen as being remote or peripheral, I mean, of course, it's a different question altogether, remote and peripheral considered to what, right? But having been considered remote, peripheral, and in some contexts even backward, this region is transforming extremely quickly, right? It's in the last couple of maybe 3 decades that this region has witnessed so much of transformation. So in a sense, I feel like there's so much that can be learned from studying, analyzing, observing the region and what's going on. And we can learn so much about other borders, other borderland politics from this region, right? And linked to that would be then questions around state building, territorialization, so the heaps of things that could be studied from looking at this region. So, and that's why I feel that there's a need to study the region. But having said that, again, when I say that, it's I feel that the region also needs to be studied from multiple perspectives, right? And it's not just simply from it's a very sort of a romanticized gaze, or just looking at the social aspect or the cultural aspect. But I think that given that the Eastern Himalayan borderland is an extremely dynamic space, we need more new research that captures all of these changes and all of these perspectives. And given my recent, like my observation and my own sort of engagement with young researchers coming up from the region and from everywhere else, but specifically from the region, it's very encouraging to see that there's a whole lot of new research that is tapping into these new ideas and new perspectives of looking at the region. And I find that really very, very encouraging. And although separated by political borders, the Eastern Himalayas has been in a very important cultural crossroad. So I think, because it's been such an important cultural crossroad, what is happening in this particular space has a long-term impact for the region, right? And I think this is where I feel there's more of this, we should emphasize and try and engage more and have more research emerging from this region. And then pertaining to the second part of your question, as I just said, that the Eastern Himalayan borderlands has been a very important cultural, sociocultural, and economic crossroads historically. People, language, culture, religion have always crossed borders seamlessly, rather seamlessly. And in my book, I focus specifically on cultural revivalism and ethnic politics in the context of the Nepali ethnic group living in Sikkim, Darjeeling, and East Nepal. And I think ethnic identity, right? So in my book, I deal specifically with ethnic identity and I suppose, there are multiple ways of reading it, but I do see it as an instrumental use of ethnicity. So I look at how Nepali groups, the Nepali ethnic group living in these three places have engaged in a form of cultural revivalism and given rise to what could be seen as a cross-border sort of ethnic politics, right? And I think, given that ethnic identity has been so important, it has historically been so important, it is, but I think, sort of inevitable that this region would be a fertile ground for cross-border ethnic rivalism and the politics that would follow on from there. And the politics around ethnicity was, I think, the more I think of it now, it's more about trying to make space and trying to create new debates around what forms, what political forms are acceptable, right? And what forms of political participation and expressions of identity are possible, and how does this eventually then help democracy, right? So we see that it's actually not challenging democratic structures, but actually ethnic politics sort of helps strengthen democracy. Having said that, right? Having said that these are, so the Nepali ethnic group living in these three different sort of political units engage in seemingly similar cultural revivalism and the concomitant ethnic politics that follow. They use their ethnic identity to seek certain political outcomes. But what are these outcomes and how they seek these outcomes varies from region to region, varies from the political unit and country in question, right? So and the big question is whether, and this is where ethnic politics now stands in the Eastern Himalayas, is whether this sort of ethnic politics was able to achieve what it set out to achieve, right? So there were certain kind of goals that they hoped these ethnic organizations, ethnic groups thought they would achieve. Whether they actually managed to do that or not, we don't know. But I think what it actually has done is it's created a new space for new engagement for ordinary people to engage with the government, to engage with the state, to kind of bargain, right? So there's a new sort of leverage that's emerged. And it's definitely added a layer of complexity in the regional politics in the context of Sikkim and Darjeeling. And also in national politics, especially in the context of Nepal.
Now, thank you, Dr. Mona, for that answer. Now you have used concrete as a means to showcase on how it can create and enable to turn a frontier or border space like Sikkim into a governable space. In context, can you elucidate on how concrete can be used to provide an alternative reading of frontier politics?
Thank you for this question. And it's really interesting when I think of when me and my co-author, we started writing about this. And I think till the point we actually started writing, or started at least thinking about it, we were quite oblivious to concrete around us, despite being surrounded by concrete. Right? It was just such a part of the Himalayan landscape and it was such an integral part of the Himalayan experience. Buildings everywhere, and lots of things, concrete around us everywhere, and we have become just so used to it. We hadn't stopped to think about concrete, right? So till that point, it was really, we hadn't thought about it. And then I suppose that's the problem with the proximity, when you're so close to where you work that you don't see the blindingly obvious. But the more we thought about it, the more we thought about how prominent and how ubiquitous it was. Concrete's everywhere, right? Right from buildings, right from massive structures on the river, to massive statues of Buddha on hilltops, or massive religious all these temples and whatever. So when we started thinking about this, we were like, we can read so much through concrete about the landscape, the politics, the people, aspirations. And I think the most important was like how concrete was a sort of an expression of desire for modernity, because it was, concrete was tied to having, a cement building was an expression of having made it in life, and also of modernity, right? Of success, of all of these things. And so concrete is in the context of the Eastern Himalayas, and as I suppose everywhere else, it is an inevitable part of the landscape, right? And I think the very fact that it's everywhere, it reflects the importance and centrality in the aspirations, right, and manifestations of modernity, not just of individuals, not just of people, not just of families, but also of governments. Because if development means being able to show, if it means, if development is something that needs to be shown, if it's development means if something that needs to be seen, then concrete really helps you do that, right? You can show development, and that's easier. So I think this is also about aspirations. Not concrete is not just about aspirations of the common man, but it's also about the government, right? And I think, and all of these changes just happened in my lifetime, especially in the context of Sikkim and Darjeeling Hills, right? It was just crazy to see all of this concrete everywhere. And I think what this proliferation of concrete does, I think in terms of frontiers, and in places like Sikkim, it takes it beyond just making it a governable space. I think it makes more of, places like Sikkim like more of an aspirational space, right? So it's gone beyond just being a governable space. It becomes more of an aspiration, right? And Sikkim being the model development state, at least amongst the different northeastern states and across even the border in Nepal and Bhutan, Sikkim is somehow seen as the model, right, of what development, what progress, what organic farming needs to look like. So in a sense, I think concrete leads to these sorts of aspirational qualities, right? So it makes a space more aspirational. It makes a space look really good. And this is a really powerful image. It's a really powerful image that translates across the region, right? So in that sense, this idea, this desire for concrete also gets sort of transferred across space, so to speak. And I think with concrete and modern technology, and of course with private finance, what we see also in the Eastern Himalayas is, and especially in Sikkim, is that given there's this, again, along with the proliferation of concrete, is also the proliferation of private finance, which is obviously looking for new markets. And with the opening up of the state to private finance, whether it be through hydropower projects or through pharmaceutical companies. So we see that with concrete, modern technology, and seemingly unlimited supply of money, anything is possible, right? We can change the course of the rivers, we can flatten hills, we can bore holes in mountains. Anything seems possible. And I think this is why concrete is so popular, because it enables whatever vision of modernity that people or the governments might have, right? And I think this is why concrete can help us, and it does help us read. It helps us tell us about aspirations. We can learn about the aspirations of the people. We can learn about the aspirations of the government. And I think what is also important is not just simply about what we can read is just the aspirational element, but it's also about what are the different kinds of, or what are the new types of politics is being engendered by this sort of concretization or concrete modernity. It brings about new sort of people, it brings about a different set of investment, it brings about a new set of relationships between the people, the government or the private sector. So there are new sort of assemblages that come up because of this. So I feel that it's a conduit for a new kind of politics that we probably in the region have not seen before. Um, and that's because, one, it's about the different kinds of assemblages, the new forms of assemblages that have to be in place or come in place because of concrete. So we've not seen those things before, but also it's got to do with the massive changes at a spatial and at an environmental level, right? So I think concrete is a sort of a conduit for a new kind of politics. And I think it also is, again, along with a new kind of politics, it's also about new kinds of entanglements, right? And on multiple scales. How people, their lives, how local communities, how their lives get entangled in either the desire for concrete or because of some form of concrete development, right? And when I say that, I'm just thinking more of the impact of, let's say, hydropower development, especially hydro that's been abandoned or not gone, right? So people, and local livelihoods, all of these seem to get entangled in new ways because of concrete. And I feel that we can read so much into concrete. Of course, the fact that it's visible, that it's tangible, right? You can see, that makes it easy also to read so much into it, right? But apart from just the physical manifestation of concrete, I think there's a lot of, we can learn a lot about the local politics, national sort of politics, and these changing dynamics between these things, right? So for instance, what we allow to, or how we allow things to get constructed, right? So it's not just simply about like what is being constructed, but who is getting to construct it, and what are the mechanisms that have been put in place, what are the processes that allow these sorts of constructions to happen, and what we allow to like either decay and turn into ruin. I think are very sort of powerful sort of ways of understanding, of reading what is actually going on in a particular place, right? For instance, so in Sikkim we have these massive statues, either of the Buddha or Shiva, or all these religious statues, across the state. So on the one hand, it can be seen as these concrete statues can be seen as, let's say, sort of an investment towards tourism, but it can also be read as an indicator of the changing ethnic profile of the state, or of the changing kind of ethnic politics, or the kinds of ethnic politics that are going on in the state. Or, for instance, the dams that we see in Sikkim and in Darjeeling district, and the dams that have been just abandoned, right? So they can also, and the ruins can also then tell us so much about failed development, failed infrastructure, the ruinations of livelihoods and communities, etc., etc. So I think, in a sense, there's concrete can tell us so much about contemporary Eastern Himalayan borderlands, and I think it definitely provides an alternative reading of the region, and I think alternative to the normative way of looking at this, with slightly romanticized, uh, either slightly romanticized way of looking at it, or just like not dealing with these sorts of development related issues. So I think the work on concrete, actually, it does provide an alternative way of looking at the ongoing impacts of development. And it adds to the question of not development for whom, but I think it's more about development for what. Like, what are we doing this for? And when I think of it, it feels like it's for more concrete. Concrete begets more concrete. Yeah, thanks.
Now, thank you for that answer, Dr. Mona. It is quite a unique framework through which to look at Borderlands. Now, our next question for you is that you have described Jorthang, a small town in Sikkim, as a zone produced through its location in a subnational border region and functioning like a special border zone without official designation. Similarly, you have worked on the transformation of Siliguri as a frontier city. Can you first briefly elaborate on these works further? And secondly, how do you see the future role of towns and cities of the Eastern Himalayas in the cross border exchanges among the BBIN or the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal countries?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Ankur. Um, I mean, I'm going to start by just giving a bit of a background to Jorthang, which I'm guessing not a lot of people know about, which is not surprising because it's a tiny town in the southern part of Sikkim, and it straddles the Darjeeling district and is separated from West Bengal by the river Rangit. Jorthang in itself, there's not much going on there. If uh, when you imagine Sikkim, right? When you think of these images of mountains, red pandas, monks, and all of that, none of that's going on in Jorthang, right? Jorthang is a valley, and it's hot and it's really dusty, and if you were to just pass through it, it would feel like there's nothing going on there. But in itself, when we started this research, it was really interesting. It was really layered space, and if you were to think, what we found really interesting about that space was that Sikkim being this, if you consider Sikkim as sort of a poster child for development, Jorthang was kind of an anomaly, because the state was seemingly absent, right? Apart from the basic facilities that it was providing, and the few sort of very visible indicators, right? Like around Sikkim, the main town area, the buildings around the main town area have all been painted green because we are a green state. And there's a promenade with the statue of Mahatma Gandhi. Then there'll be a fountain. So what we call the Sikkim vernacular, right? Like in our paper. So that this set of sort of indicators of green Sikkim, you'll find them in every sort of town and bigger towns in the district and whatever, right? So Jordan also has that, but that, to us, that was almost the end of the state's investment. And it felt like it was just being, that been like, you know, left, you know, by the state for it to basically fend for itself. um and you know, and there were no sort of course there were rules and regulations, but it was not being like implemented. So it was like this really sort of a crazy space. And this was also, you know, the craziness, I suppose, was also sort of exacerbated by the fact that it was a border town. And they've always been, you know, and when I say a border, it's not like really heavily manned border. There are like, you know, heaps of places through which you can easily cross across to West Bengal. And these also, like, you know, created opportunities for different kinds of activities along the border. And so we thought that was like really fascinating, because, you know, it really didn't live up, Jorthang didn't live up to the picture, the image and the hype of Sikkim. Um, so so and also this is, you know, it was important because in Sikkim we a lot of development is geared more towards tourism, right? And Jorthang obviously doesn't cater to any of those sort of touristic images. So in a way, like, you know, Jorthang was left to fend for itself, and it did that through it felt like, you know, it was doing that, you know, through you know, mostly sort of what we thought were like, you know, like looks like delinquent activities. Of course, there were like a lot of commercial activity going on, because Jorthang is a valley that then, you know, supports or like provides everything from food to cement to the hills and whatever, right? So it's an important commercial center. But there's also a lot of like informal and illegal trade that happens across the border. And that's what actually, especially the alcohol trade, the alcohol is cheaper in Sikkim, so a lot of that makes its way across to West Bengal, to Darjeeling. So all of these things were really fascinating, and there's also like a few hydro projects around in that area. So there's all of these different things that were sort of coming together, right? So all sorts of like informal, illegal activities, this uh, really exponential commercial activity, but very concentrated commercial activity. Then there's this private sector, there's hydropower and all of these. So all of these things were coming together in this one space, which seemed really unregulated, right? So, and in a sense, it did work like an economic zone, but it was not like an official economic zone, right? But there seemed to be this uh, unspoken rules and laws around how things would function. And because of the coming together of all of these in this one tiny space, it had also led to a sort of you know, different kind of urbanization, because it was attracting people from all sorts of places. So it was really interesting to see also the kind of urbanization. So for us, I think what Jorthang signified was the kind of developments that are taking place in Borderlands, developments, and what are the kinds of urbanization, right? What are the forms of urbanization taking place? And specifically here was what, you know, all of this was happening because of what we call delinquent development, right? So it's not about state-led investment that is leading to this kind of development and this kind of urbanization, but it was more around delinquent activities that was leading to this sort of development that we see in a border town. And so it was really fascinating, and also to see that, you know, to think of it as a sort of a special economic zone, but without actually being designated as one. And as I developed my work further, I also you know, I realized that one could think of Sikkim in that same way also. Sikkim could be thought of as a de facto special economic zone, where the entire state behaves like a special economic zone. Although Sikkim is not designated as a special economic zone, but it behaves like one. The entire state behaves like one, where the private companies can set up shop anywhere they want to. They can, so they have lots of incentives. So all the features that you would find in an official special economic zone, you'd also find it in Sikkim, right? So in that sense, so the idea of also this de facto special economic zone also, I suppose, evolved from this work on Jorthang. So for us, it was like, the contrast was really glaring, where in Sikkim, in most parts of Sikkim, where development is really pushed by government, and there's a standard sort of way of doing things. There's like heaps of rules and regulations. What we see in Jorthang is a complete sort of I won't say complete abandonment of these rules and regulations, but they were not like really well enforced. And yeah, so development was being pushed by all sorts of delinquent activities. So for us, that was the really interesting thing about Jorthang. And then moving on to Siliguri. Again, I don't know if like everybody would know Siliguri, but this is also known as the chicken's neck. And it's a really important, well, actually one of the largest, one of the fastest growing cities in northern West Bengal. And it's extremely important because it's one of the largest, I suppose, the only city that connects mainland India to different parts of the northeast, and also to the hills of Sikkim and Darjeeling and Bhutan and Nepal. So it's a really interesting space, and it's a fantastic space to do research. But doing research in Siliguri takes a lot of, I would say, effort and heart, because the city has just grown and changed so much, and in a very short period of time, that there's just so many layers to unravel, right? So you need to, it's just, you think you understand one aspect of it, and then there's something else that completely throws you off. So I suppose my work on Siliguri is still, it's a bit of a work in, it's an ongoing thing. But the research that I did do in Siliguri was around looking at sort of like an ethnic, taking an ethnic perspective and seeing how has the city changed, right? What is the transformation in the city? So as the city has expanded, as the commerce in the city has expanded, as it has grown, it has fundamentally changed spatially and socially. And what we see is that there has been the growth of ethnic enclaves. So we see more people of belonging to certain ethnic group living in certain parts of the city, a lot of people moving out of these parts. And there's always been, and there's also the emergence of some sort of tension about who can claim the city, right? Because of Siliguri's location, it's highly contested as to who the original inhabitants of Siliguri are, right? So there'll be like lots of groups claiming that they are the original inhabitants of Siliguri. And, especially given what is happening now, proof of belonging to a territory is extremely important, right? I mean, and that drives a whole lot of ethnic politics in the region. I mean, if you think of the Gorkhaland movement, it's also about belonging, and belonging that is validated through territory. So Siliguri is really fascinating in that sense, and the city is expanding, and it's also leading to the growth of ethnic clusters, and so that's one layer. But the other layer that complicates this thing in Siliguri is that the city is also changing, but the change is also sort of temporary, and well, the appropriate word would be seasonal, because the city is changing because of migration, but the migration is also one of it is permanent. A lot of people moving from different parts of neighboring states permanently to live and work in Siliguri, because it's an expanding commercial center that has a lot of economic opportunities. And also, as cities do, there's a level of anonymity, so that people can, the different kinds of work that become legal and illegal that become available. But the other kind of migration in Siliguri is also around temporary migration from the hills during the winters. And that really changes the spatial dynamics of the city. And that makes it, adds another layer of complexity to Siliguri, right? What is fascinating is that it gives rise to a very sort of a shifting, seasonal urban landscape. And with the coming of the winter migrants, so to speak, the kind of ethnic politics in that space also changes, right? So that's really fascinating, and that's where my work on Siliguri is. So I mean, of course, talking about Jorthang and Siliguri, which it probably means nothing to people who are now either working on the region or are not from here, whatever. So it wouldn't mean a lot to people. But I think, and I think that's why it's important. These nondescript spaces that probably people have not heard of. Trying to understand what's happening in these spaces is really important, given that they are now sort of hubs of migration. They are hubs of people, they're hubs of opportunities, they're hubs of, uh, you know, uh, all sorts of economic activities, right? And it draws people. So we see with increased infrastructural development, we have increased mobility, we have increased, changes in aspirations. People want that more people are mobile, more people are moving out. And so these spaces are actually turning into hubs, right? And understanding these spaces are very important in terms of our understanding of how the region itself is changing, right? And I think this is how places like Siliguri, Jorthang, these small towns and cities that are emerging as hubs are extremely important, and they already are playing a fundamental role in the BBN exchanges, right? So this place has always been, crossroads of economic and cultural activities. And in a sense, it's going on, right? So this has never stopped. But I think with the increased mobility, with increased infrastructural development, I think the importance of these spaces is just going to increase, and that's why it's extremely vital, I think, to understand, to analyze these spaces, and to understand what is happening, and then to try and use that to understand the changes that might be happening regionally, nationally, and even internationally, right? Because this is such a important space, a melting pot of so many different cultures, people, nations, right? So I think these are really important spaces to try and understand, and then to try and see and what we can learn about the different borderlands in the region. Thank you.
Now, thank you, Dr. Mona, for that answer. Now, you have undertaken extensive ethnographic fieldwork in the Eastern Himalayas borderlands. Can you share some insights from the fieldwork, in particular the challenges that you have faced and opportunities that you foresee?
I have definitely been extremely lucky to be able to do research in my home space, right, so to speak. But having said that, I think there are many challenges to also working in the space where you're from. As I said before, there's the problem that comes with proximity and over familiarity, is that you forget, you don't see things, you take things for granted. And But I think, apart from that, I think one of the biggest challenges for me when I was doing my research has been probably of access. And by access, I mean, one is obviously the geographical access also, right? Some places can be very difficult to, or very hard to reach. And it requires a level of physical fitness to get there. And so in that sense, access can be hard. But the other kind of impediment to access has also been sort of getting access to, working with government officials or bureaucrats or politicians, right? So getting access to because a lot of work also, a lot of my work that I do is also reliant on getting access to first the gatekeepers, and then from there on, then to the other people, right? So to my respondents. So I have had like a lot of challenges getting, being stopped by bureaucracy, being stalled by, all the or politicians or whatever. Yeah? So there's been access on that sort of an institutional level also. So the one is the geographical access, but the second is also like an institutional sort of impediment to access. But I think these are challenges that all researchers face, right? We all have spent endless amounts of time in some office, waiting for the babu to come, right? So these are all like sort of like challenges that I think that we all as researchers face. But I think for me, these things have also been sort of I wouldn't say exacerbated, but what has really affected is being from the region, my identity, who I am as what ethnic group I belong to, what place I am from, what caste, what class, all of these big things. That's really also affected, access to people. And it's also about how people in the field view me, right? And what then that means in terms of actually them either opening doors or closing doors. And I think one of the most important things is also gender. Has been really important. I mean, again, this is very tricky because sometimes it works, right? So all of these belong, sometimes you tick all the boxes, right? So you belong to the right ethnic category, the right caste group, whatever these things, whatever things that people think are important for them to be able to talk to you or interact with you, or welcome you into their house, whatever, right? So sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and it's really tricky. And also, I think being a female, it has its own challenges. And I think it's again probably a common sort of experience for a lot of women who work on the kind of things, on similar kinds of things that I study, right? So if you're spending a lot of time in offices or in factories or in, the offices of some politician or whatever, right? So you get a lot of mansplained. So there's a lot of that happens. And with time and with experience, you learn how to deal with that too. But I think that has been like, I would consider a challenge, in a sense. Um, and but I think, with time you learn to deal with all of these things. And I think in terms of, when I think of gender, it has worked for me, in to my advantage also, because especially in the kind of in the last research that I've been doing, which is working with on female on women working in pharmaceutical factories. So in that sense, my gender has also been really helpful. Women have found it easier to talk to me and relate to me, and etc. So that's been really helpful. So I think those are the sort of challenges. But I think as researchers, with time, we just learn how to navigate these things and try not to get really affected. When one door closes, we try and find another way. And in terms of opportunities, I think there's a lot of space for collaboration, I feel. And I think, and I'm, trying to engage in different kinds of collaborations also as an author and as an editor of a new research coming out from the region, and also trying to create a space for young researchers from the region. So we've started this initiative called the Eastern Himalayan series. And so yeah, so those are the sort of opportunities that I see. And I think there's opportunities also in terms of the stuff that, the things that can be studied in the region, right? So there's just so many things happening. And I think that's really creating space for young researchers, new researchers to really engage in really meaningful work right now.
Now, thank you, Dr. Mona, for that answer and also for this informative interaction. I would request the audience to please check out Dr. Mona's recent book, which you can access through the link which is provided in the description section.